Welcome to the In Defense of the Fence podcast, the podcast where on-the-fencers go to see both sides just a little bit clearer. I'm Ryder.
And I'm Thinker.
And on today's episode, debunking misinformation surrounding the Hurricane Helene relief.
And the release of Jack Smith's official filing against Donald Trump. What's in it and what does it mean? Misinformation surrounding Hurricane Helene. Before we get started, I just want to say I hope everybody in Florida and the affected areas are safe and
North Carolina,
well sheltered, and my feelings go out to anybody who has unfortunately lost somebody due to this terrible natural disaster.
We are accepting donations and tips from the podcast on the live streams, and all donations and proceeds will be going to AmeriCare's disaster relief fund for those affected by Hurricane Helene.
Yes. It's a very big subject now. FEMA is dealing with a lot of issues surrounding misinformation that is being spread predominantly by Trump and the Trump campaign. FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, it is the federal government's arm for dealing with all sorts of natural disasters. One of the very first lies that Trump has been telling in regards to this is the money is being spent on housing for immigrants, and that's FEMA money. Money that is sent to FEMA is being used as funding to house immigrants. This is not true. Blatantly not true. And this is according to FEMA's website. They have said that no money is being diverted from disaster response efforts. The response effort is funded by the Disaster Relief Fund, which is a dedicated disaster fund. So what that essentially means is that this money can only be used for disasters. This money can't be taken out and used for any other purpose than that. The idea that the Trump campaign is trying to spread that money is somehow being funneled into other purposes, blatantly not true. It can't be used for anything else. It is a fund set up and dedicated specifically to disaster relief, and FEMA are the only people who can use that money.
It's hard not to see this in terms of just pure politics, because North Carolina is a swing state. Immigration is, by and large, the Trump campaign's main talking point, and anything that you can do to divert the topic towards immigration, especially FEMA, especially since we know that Project 2025 is solely responsible for trying to drive a wedge between people and their believability of the federal government and the faith in the federal government. There is absolutely, as you said, Thinker, not a single shred of evidence to suggest that any funds are being diverted towards illegal immigrants from FEMA. That is physically impossible.
FEMA has come out and directly said FEMA had to set up a section on their website labeled Hurricane Helene and Milton rumors. That's first of all, that's crazy. They've had to set this up specifically because there are so many lies and misinformation flying around about these hurricanes specifically. It is a representation of how seriously these lies have affected FEMA's operation to do their job.
Right, because we said that we weren't going to get in the weeds of the rhetoric, and we really won't, because a lot of that stuff is disgusting. But more than that, it's just mind-numbing at this point. Everybody has heard what they need to hear. We know Donald Trump. We know what he will say, whether it's the truth, whether it's a lie. The only reason that we are covering this right now is because there are some very life-threatening consequences to these rumors continuing. And that's why it's so important to talk about.
Another one that I saw, he said that there were no helicopters being used to help rescue people. Just blatantly not true. The National Guard's website has an entire article on it about how they've been using helicopters, high water vehicles, and boats to rescue people. Another bit of misinformation that is being spread is this idea that FEMA is only giving out $750 in financial disaster relief. Not true. This is one of those ones that can be perceived as true only because when you sign up and apply for disaster aid, the first bit of aid they give you is $750. But that $750 is only for the absolute essentials that you need in that exact moment. Baby formula, food, it is for water, the things that people need at that exact moment in order to get to the next day. That is not saying that that is the only financial aid that they get. There is more financial aid available upon application. They've taken this idea that the first bit of aid that you get, the 750, is the only aid that you're getting. The fact of it is that FEMA has multiple different financial aids that they provide dependent on the severity level of your situation that you can apply for.
That first $750 is serious needs assistance. And
Yes.
it says the title is exactly what it is for. It is for your first initial serious needs, which you alluded to exactly what that covers. But it is by no means the only amount of payment that you get from them.
That's the one that worries me one of the lies that worries me the most, only because it's one of those things that if you don't do deep research into it, it sounds true. Because yes, the first bit of money is that exact amount. But if you don't go any deeper than the first initial financial aid that you get, that looks like the only financial aid that you're getting.
But
So, and I thought,
because I don't know if that's like the most detrimental one for me, but like only because if you're going to an official and you're looking for that assistance, they can very easily tell you. They might not even have to be prompted to tell you this is not all the money that you're going to get. You're getting more after.
well, there is another issue inherent in all of this that it is directly related to that, which I will get to. But the very last bit of misinformation that I want to get into here, because I think it's extremely important, is this idea that FEMA is seizing homes from affected people and giving those homes to migrants.
Yeah, that's the one for me.
That again, this is according to directly to FEMA's official website. They are not doing this. FEMA has come out and said FEMA does not have the authority to seize your property or lands. They had to put this part in, which is that applying for aid from FEMA does not give FEMA or the federal government the right to seize those property or lands. And the reason that that is important for them to put that in there is because this entire thing has caused a major problem where people are not going to FEMA for assistance because they're afraid that they're going to have their lands or property seized and taken away from them. People are directly not seeking help because of this information.
This was the one that got me the most. We can write off a lot of the other misinformation, and it's hard to see, again, why this isn't strictly political, because none of this is true, and there would be no other reason to lie about this if you didn't want to drive a wedge between people and the
Mhm.
faith in the federal government. This
Mhm.
otherwise, FEMA is blameless. FEMA is not even bipartisan; it's nonpartisan. It will
It's
help you out
nonpartisan.
whether you are a Republican or a Democrat. It will lift you up in the chopper or put you in the boat whether you have voted for Trump, whether you voted for Clinton or Biden or
Yeah.
Obama. It does not matter. The problem here is that people, when they're seeing FEMA officials on the street, they are actively not going towards them for help because of the lies that they have believed that
Mhm.
they will have some sort of asset that they own seized or claimed by the federal government because they
Yeah.
believe in this lie. And I'm not saying it's everybody, but North Carolina
No.
is a swing state for a reason. So
Yes.
there is a certain amount of electorate, and I hate talking about victims of natural disasters as an electorate, but there was a certain number of people who follow Trump who will believe this. And those people are not seeking assistance because they're afraid of the federal government, who is
Yeah.
literally only there to help. They don't care
Yes.
who you voted for. They don't care, what your taxes are. They are there to save your life. This can't be this easily believed. That's like saying the TSA agents have the right to stay in your guest room. There's no possible way for this to ever be true. There's not even a grain of truth, because what you were saying before, is that they capitalized on the $750 payment. And I believe one of the first people to spread it around was Laura Ingraham, saying that
Yeah.
that was the only money that you were going to get. There's a grain of truth in it that the $750 is an amount of money that is received. Here, there's absolutely no foundational truth.
And
And this
I
is the
think that
most
that was
dangerous one. And you can see the timeline of Trump's mentality in this. And I'm not saying that this is not partisan, but you can see the timeline of the statements that he makes. He first started off by saying that FEMA can possess your house. He then
mhm.
said FEMA's funds were being reallocated from disaster relief towards
Yeah.
helping illegal immigrants. And then right after that, those two lies merged into Trump saying that FEMA was possessing your home, your assets, and giving them to illegal immigrants. And you can see it in real time on stage where he comes up with that lie and then he expounds upon it by realizing that he can go further with it. It's the same thing that he does with numbers, and we'll talk about that in the second half of this podcast.
Yeah. Just a bit of additional information. The House has the opportunity to give additional funding to FEMA right now, but Mike Johnson is refusing to reconvene the House to even discuss it. So we will hopefully see where that goes. I just want it known that FEMA is doing everything they can. They're out there, they're helping.
Yeah.
There is disaster relief money available for people who need it.
Did you see the AI pictures that they're putting out?
Yes, I did.
Which again is
It's
just
not
meant to
helpful.
spread more. Yeah, no, it's meant to spread more misinformation. And we cannot stress enough that this is dangerous. It's not
Yeah.
even just partisan anymore. It is risking lives. Like
Yeah.
the
People's
idea,
lives are at risk.
there are certain people who shouldn't be used and exploited, and it's disaster relief victims, mass shooting victims, and just victims in general.
Politically, we're better than this. You know,
Mhm.
part of politics is maintain politics isn't just the cold calculating analysis of facts and reason. Politics at their center are a means to provide a moral and equitable system for everyone.
And unfortunately, as history shows, the closer we are to election day, the more likely this stuff is to happen. Like it is very rare that this kind of rumor mill and misinformation dump would have happened had it not occurred in November of 2022.
I do happen to think that it's gotten worse over the past decade.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't remember the October surprises or the, October like shit slinging. it,
Sure. At this point,
it
why
it
not?
just it wasn't as prevalent a decade ago, and
Mhm.
this political scene has become, how many political surprises can we drop on our opponent and how much slander can we put out there about them?
Now, for those who haven't been listening, Judge Tanya Chutkin has just released the official release filing of Special Counsel Jack Smith's indictment against former President Donald J. Trump and the alleged attempt to overturn said election. Now, before we talk about this at all, we need to state that this is all an indictment. This is all an allegation. Every citizen in America is innocent until proven guilty. None of these things have been proven despite all the rhetoric. This is all just a filing to get a trial. Keep that in mind. Everything that we're talking about right now so far is an allegation. I read all 165 pages of it. And if you want to listen to it, there is a bonus episode on this podcast reading through the entire filing. I urge you guys to read it. It is nothing but informative. It is really telling. If all of these allegations are true, it is almost irrefutable that Donald Trump did know about everything that he was doing. In fact, it seems it makes him the centerpiece towards this. Now, why is this so different? Well, this is different for many reasons. The main reason being that after the Supreme Court ruled that presidential immunity has wider parameters than we originally anticipated, Jack Smith could have just put this all aside and put this case to rest. However, he decided to come back with a reinvigorated court filing an indictment explaining why
Yeah.
all of these charges against Donald Trump do not qualify for presidential immunity. One of the main reasons is that because they are not presidential acts, and we'll get into that near the end. The first half of this indictment entails exactly what Donald Trump is being accused of. So many things that we've heard before: tampering, spreading misinformation, dissemination, trying to get individual states to overturn their ballots, to send fake electors, to get Mike Pence to go against his oath, and to send some of the electors and ballots and votes back down to the states, and to just plainly say that the vice president can overturn the election, which obviously, as Mike Pence has stated multiple times, that can't happen. So a
Yeah.
few things I thought were interesting. It goes through many, many specific examples, some that we've heard, some that we didn't
Yeah.
hear. So, like, for example, one thing that was new for me was 2:24 on January 6th. During the attack, Trump took to Twitter to condemn Pence, saying he lacked courage because Pence had resisted Trump's pressure to intervene in the Electoral College certification after the Capitol had already been breached. Now,
Mm.
he, of course, knew exactly what he was doing. As soon as Mike Pence didn't do what Trump asked, that's when the tweet came out. And they had
Mm.
already breached the Capitol. And we saw that MAGA supporters over a loudspeaker, over megaphones, were reading the tweet that he had just put out, and it just
Yeah.
set everything into motion. Um,
Yeah.
Second thing, the numbers. The numbers were a big thing in this indictment. What Jack Smith is alleging is that the numbers shifted from day to day, even from hour to hour, when you're talking about illegal counting, illegal ballots that were cast in any and only the swing states. So Trump and allies would make up numbers. So, for example, they allege Arizona. He alleged 36,000 non-citizens cast ballots. And then it was a few 100,000 5 days later. Then 40 to 50,000. Then 32,000, and then finally back to the original 36,000. And it wasn't because he was receiving different information, because he wasn't. The same information that he got from every elector, every government official, every secretary of state from those states that he reached out to, you can see on the transcripts, the texts, and the calls that those state representatives had told him that the number consistently was zero.
Yeah.
So the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands, it was just a number that he felt was applicable at the
Yeah.
time. It wasn't because he was receiving new information. It was because allegedly those were the numbers that he thought would provoke the base the most, or
Yeah.
at least call for a recount.
It's insane to think that that you're just throwing numbers out. You're just making numbers up.
Well, and here's where the claim comes that he is making those numbers up, because when Trump called then Arizona Governor Doug Ducey that he was packaging up fraud evidence to share with him, no evidence was ever provided. He was never
Mm.
sent anything. And then even further, when it was pressed in court, Giuliani actually came out saying that there was no evidence across any of the court cases. It was just theories, but there was no
Yeah.
evidence to back it up, which is exactly why, if you were to have any evidence, I understand that these are allegations. They're allegations that Trump was the sole ringleader of it. But
Yeah.
the conviction is all of the failed court cases across all the states that these were challenged in, because, and Giuliani is on record saying, there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud. If
Yeah.
anything, the allegation here is that the voter fraud and election fraud came from the Trump campaign.
Yeah.
There's a passage in here that describes a Trump campaign event, which they name as a co-conspirator. They don't actually say the person's name, allegedly sought to create chaos at a polling center in Detroit when it became clear that a batch of election returns favorable to Biden were legitimate. And he
Uh-huh.
said, "Find a reason it isn't," the alleged co-conspirator said. When he heard a violent outbreak was imminent, the campaign employee replied, "Make them riot and do it." Now, Trump
Uh-huh.
used these events to claim that the rioters were voters who weren't being allowed to cast their vote, when in fact they were just simply MAGA rioters.
Uh-huh.
But he used those images and those videos to claim that those people were actually voters who were being told that they weren't able to vote, that they were Republicans who weren't able to watch the counting of the vote, but they were just rioters. And the campaign itself
Mhm.
incentivized those people to go and harass the pollers. What are your thoughts
Okay.
on that?
Oh, I think that voter protections are essential in this country.
Hmm.
And if your campaign is essentially encouraging individuals to go out and menace and threaten and coerce at polling stations, that undermines everything democracy is.
Even if we don't exactly know, and it's not proven in a court of law yet, where the incentivizing came from, we at least know that violent protests happened outside of these
Yes.
polling stations.
Which doesn't promote confidence in the system of voting. You're far less likely to want to go to your polling station, if that polling station has a bunch of angry, rioting MAGA people out front. You
Well,
know?
here's the thing, is that those riots only happened after it was determined that that batch of votes were legitimately for
Well,
Biden,
then
not
maybe.
before. Because
Well,
if it were voters that were being told that they couldn't vote, the protests
well,
would have happened before.
it creates this environment where the people that want to do this for the honest, upright reasons won't
Mhm.
want to do this anymore if they're constantly under threat of being sued or fired or doxxed, because we've seen that that's happened to certain polling members as well.
This one doesn't have a whole lot of juice in it. It doesn't really have much to do with Trump, but it was in there and it's still interesting. You listening might be asking, how is it that there are so many examples? Well, there are a lot of people who are co conspirators, which means that if they're unindicted co conspirators, that might mean that they have worked with the FBI, they've worked with the special
Mhm.
counsel. There are people who just come forth, there are whistleblowers, but there are also instances where the campaign might not have been so careful. The file talks extensively about Rudy Giuliani. It doesn't name him per se because it's redacted, but it names
Mhm.
Trump's personal attorney, who was either Rudy Giuliani or Sidney Powell. But we know that this example is Giuliani because it was talked extensively in the news when it happened. Is that
Yeah,
Giuliani attempted to send a proposed resolution to Michigan lawmakers declaring the election to be in dispute, which it was not in dispute, but he
it's
sent a
not.
letter to get them to say that it was in dispute, but he sent it to the wrong number. And so, like,
Mm.
and so again, and so we know that that happened. That's already been proven true, which shows that the Trump campaign was not that careful in disseminating a lot of this really, really sensitive material.
Yeah,
Also,
yeah.
one of the main reasons why Jack Smith feels like he has a case here is because Trump claimed to say that the entire system was rigged. He said there was voter fraud and election fraud
Mhm.
all over the entire United States. But Jack Smith notes in this filing that Trump only reached out to swing states. He only reached out to swing states that he was losing in. He only reached out to swing states he was losing in with a Republican governor, and he
Mhm.
only claimed fraud in his race, not any of the other races on the ticket.
Yeah.
So you can claim widespread fraud, but what Jack Smith is alluding to is that he single handedly picked very specific states with certain races. And the only race that he picked was his.
If this is true, that's
Well, it
hard
is
to.
true. We know that part. We
Well,
know that
we.
we saw he reached out to Arizona, Nevada,
Oh, okay.
North
I mean,
Carolina,
yes. Yes,
Michigan.
he did.
Well, we don't know that, but he claimed that there was fraud in those states. He didn't claim that there was fraud in California or New
Hmm.
York. We heard the audio from his call with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, which
Yeah.
again
Yeah.
is mentioned in the court filing in Georgia, saying, "Find me this many thousand votes." But he didn't do that in Oregon, California, Washington. He didn't do it in states that weren't inherently a swing state that he was losing in.
Yeah.
That part is right now, it's the motive behind it that
Yeah.
is being litigated right now in court or is being asked to being litigated.
It's hard to find a reason to support that evidence that doesn't point to him trying to overturn the election. It's hard to look at this as anything other than an attempt to affect the vote. I don't see an avenue in my brain where that wasn't the motive. There could be. And again, we don't know. This is an indictment to get a trial. So we don't know what the motive was. I am
Right.
simply stating that from my perspective, it's hard to see any other reason for that.
Which is exactly what's really alluded to at length in this court filing, is that Trump allegedly reached out to specific swing states who met the parameters of ones that he was barely
Yeah.
losing in, ones with Republican governors, and only claimed that his race had fraud, but not any other race down ballot. Now, Why are we hearing about this now? Well, the main reason that Judge Tanya Chutkan released this, it's now public, the entire thing is out there. The main reason why this is new is because Jack Smith now has to put this through the filter of why this does not constitute as presidential immunity. Because the Supreme Court has now said that every official act done by the president is considered a presidential act and is covered under complete presidential immunity. So Jack Smith's challenge here is to show why everything that happened regarding the 2020 election and the alleged plot to overturn the 2020 election does not constitute as official acts and is therefore not considered covered under presidential immunity.
Now,
So,
is this before the election was finalized? Most of this stuff in this indictment, is it before the election was finalized and he was just running around trying to find votes, or was it officially shown
well,
that Biden won at that point?
Well, the timeline shows that this had started obviously before election day and it continued after, and the culmination was January 6th. And then you didn't really hear
Okay.
much about it afterward. A lot of this is coming from the weeks prior to election day and then the months after, because the weeks prior, Trump was explicitly told by his campaign advisors that the results on election day might be misleading because Trump had created so much lack of faith in the mail in voting system in
Hmm.
his supporters that most of his supporters were likely to vote in person. So the initial lead that Trump was probably going to take might be misleading because they haven't counted the mail in ballots, which, as you know, afterwards, Trump tried to say that any mail in ballot is illegitimate. But that's only because it took his lead away. Now, why not immune? Presidential acts. What does that mean? What constitutes presidential immunity? Well, anything that is an official act done by the president. So the president conferring with the vice president on a governmental matter, that is considered covered under presidential immunity. The president speaking with anybody in his cabinet, directing the military, given a directive, that is considered presidential immunity. So why does Jack Smith feel like he has a case? Well, the reason he feels like he has a case is because when you are campaigning, when you are a president seeking re-election, you are now what's considered an office seeker. You're not an office holder. An office seeker, Jack Smith is arguing, does not qualify for presidential immunity because running for election is not a presidential act and it's not an official act. So even if Trump is talking to Pence, if he's talking to Pence about the election, about how votes need to be overturned or to look for election fraud, two things there. One, talking to your vice president no longer becomes a presidential act if you are talking about reelection, because now you two are talking as office seekers, not office holders. And two, it is not the president's job to oversee the counting of votes or anything regarding an election. That is not a presidential duty. And therefore, Jack Smith is saying that it does not qualify for presidential immunity.
So let me see if I got this straight.
Yep.
If Trump at the time that he was campaigning addressed the nation about
Hmm.
some disaster, some natural disaster, let's say the fires happening in California at that time,
Yep.
that would have been considered a presidential act. Him
Yep.
speaking at a campaign rally, he is there, he is no longer at that campaign in a presidential capacity. He is there in a office seeking capacity.
Yeah. Well, technically, even unless you're giving like the presidential address or the State of the Union, speaking directly to the public is not a presidential act. And especially if you're at something called a campaign rally, you pretty much say in the title that you are not doing something that is considered a presidential act because you're at a campaign rally. That is the biggest argument, that nothing that Trump did under this is considered a presidential act. Now, looking at exactly what happened, and if say everything up to the first half of this filing turns out to be true, then that means that Trump did pressure people to overturn election. He oversaw the sending of fake electors with the chairman of the RNC at the time, organizing things like January 6th, having a direct part, having full knowledge. If this turns out to be true, Trump had full knowledge of him losing by the end of November. Mind you,
Mhm.
January 6th was almost 2 months after, and Trump allegedly knew full well that he had lost. And there's actually something in here that's quoting him saying that somebody overheard him on Marine One telling Ivanka and Jared, it doesn't matter if you won or lost the election, you still have to fight like hell. I don't know how that would ever be corroborated unless they brought that person and had him speak on the stand. But
Yeah.
if everything in the first, let's say, 90 pages is true, then that would mean that everything that he did was in service of the campaign as an office seeker, especially if he's reaching out to government officials in various states about the election. And it's also said in this briefing, he spoke so much to government officials that he would have fly to the White House that they would start coming up with other things like talking about COVID just to avoid talking about things like this.
Yeah.
And he had government officials in the room talking about things, but then he would invite his campaign staff, which no longer meant that that was considered a presidential act because he would invite reluctant campaign officials to sit in on these meetings, thus nullifying anything having to do with the presidential act because now you've involved your presidential reelection campaign in.
Yeah.
That is the argument that Jack Smith is going to have to prove in court, that none of this is considered a presidential act because everything he did in hopes to overturn the 2020 election was in service of his campaign, thus making him not qualified for presidential immunity here.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. It has a lot of logical reasoning behind it.
Can you think of an argument as to why this wouldn't constitute presidential immunity? Because the argument that the other side is going to make is that this does constitute as presidential immunity because he was talking to the vice president. He was talking to the vice president about his official duties as president of the Senate. And all you have to do if you're on the other side is find one nugget of truth in presidential immunity to make that claim that there's one thing that's presidentially immune. And then I feel like it's like a house of cards. If you can find one thing, then you can't list that
yeah, if you can
even
find
as
one,
evidence.
if you can find one thing that does count, then it
Mhm.
doesn't matter if everything else in there wasn't. The entire
Right.
thing comes falling down.
That is
So
exactly what makes this a lot harder for Jack Smith.
he had to spend time combing through every single bit of this and
Mhm.
thinking on every single point, thinking, what's the argument for this as a non-presidential act, and what is the argument that could be made to say that this is a presidential act? And then he had to go through and see that, make sure that he could prove or that he could disprove that
Mhm.
other argument before he
Yeah.
added that to the indictment. And
Yeah.
I imagine he had to do that with every single one of these points because any one of them could result in the entire thing getting thrown out.
Right. Well, the good news for the Trump campaign is that they could easily have a dispute about presidential immunity over discussions with Mike Pence over his ceremonial duties as president of the Senate. Because I could see it on both sides. Because, yes, you were talking with the vice president about his executive functions, but you were talking to him about his presidential functions in the context of overturning the election, if this turns out to be true. Now, the bad news for them is that even if that is considered presidential act and qualifies for presidential immunity, you have a lot more to argue against. Just because that's considered presidentially immune and you can't bring that up, as Jack Smith in his prosecutorial briefing, they still have a lot of other events and discussions and meetings to go off of prior to January 6th.
Yeah, but I guess it goes back to your house of cards point that if that one point is enough, then none of the rest matters.
Well, January 6th was the culmination to a lot of other efforts to overturn the election, from, again, sending fake electors, from
Mhm.
trying to get voters to, or trying to get electors to overturn certain rules, to trying to intimidate poll workers. Like, look at Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, and how Trump has still
Yeah.
refused to concede any wrongdoing in that. I mean, there's a defamation case in there if they wanted, but they did that with Giuliani.
Yeah.
With Trump's personal attorney Sidney Powell claiming all the things about Dominion voting, also trying to get people to overturn and saying that, trying to get her to investigate Dominion voting systems, which turned out to be false. It's almost like playing whack-a-mole because there are so many examples and there are going to be so many allegations of election fraud here.
Yeah.
Is going to be very, very difficult for the Trump campaign to get out of saying that they did not do this. But whether it qualifies under presidential immunity, that's another thing. Because if for some reason the Trump campaign can convince the court, because ultimately this is not for Judge Chutkan. This has been written specifically for its inevitable return to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
If they can somehow prove that overseeing an election is a presidential act, then that's the only way I see this winning. But other than that, I think they have an uphill battle to fight here.
I do believe that the information that he has makes sense. It's a good argument. It is a good argument. I want to be cautious because we've seen strong arguments go to the Supreme Court before and lose. They faced uphill battles before. We thought 100 other court cases that were brought from there were uphill battles for him, and then they turned out to be nothing.
Let me ask you this: do you think Judge Chutkan should take into account Election Day coming up?
I think so, only because I think the American people need to be able to feel like they've made their own decision without outside influences being the predominant factor. And I feel like Judge Chutkan bringing the trial back before Election Day at this point would just be perceived as a way to influence the election. I think to the undecided voter who looks at that, they see, oh, you're bringing this back to court 26 days before the election? How convenient. Any action by either side at this point just looks like an attempt to influence voters. And I think that voters don't want to be influenced. They want to make their decision. I don't feel that the undecided voter wants another controversy right before the election.
Now, do you think that that's up for the judicial system to take into account?
See, now we're getting into the real philosophical questions of this.
Well, see, so the only reason I ask is because when you become a judge, there is an oath that you have to take, and part of it says that none of your filings or your decisions will be influenced by politics. And so that includes choosing a date. So I understand why Judge Merchan moved it to after, but Judge Chutkan already came out saying that she is not going to be deterred by Election Day coming up. And so I would argue that if you have a job to do, that is your job to do, and it's to get to the bottom of this case. And especially if you're looking on the outside, of course, Judge Chutkan is not taking this into account because why should she? One thing I would say that I would agree with is that if the truth does come out before Election Day, which it is extremely unlikely that this is going to happen before Election Day. If it for some reason does or something comes out before Election Day, I think the undecided voter does deserve to know when they're in the booth whether or not one of the people that they might be voting for did try to overturn democracy.
That's a fair point. That is actually a very, very good point. The question for me becomes whether or not the undecided voter has any faith in the judicial system anymore, or whether they just think that this is going to be, oh, okay, you want me to have an informed decision, right? You're not trying to influence anything, right?
And so how do you battle against that perceived bias? Because that's what happened with James Comey.
Writer, I think that if we had an answer to that question, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in right now.
Possibly. My opinion on it.
I think that if anybody had an answer to that perception, no.
My opinion on it is that there is a duty to uphold, and that is to find the truth. And that search for the truth does not have a timeline. Everything should come second to the judicial system's timeline. Unfortunately, we are close to Election Day. This is what it is. Now, the judicial system is not the FBI, so I can't speak for why James Comey dropped that bombshell about Hillary Clinton right before the election. But when it comes to court cases and trials, again, this is a trial, the trial of his own peers. that this would be happening, and there were going to be so many testimonies to come through before a decision is even made. This is not going to end before election day, but the public is owed a speedy trial. That is what we are guaranteed. And we have been putting this off for long enough. And I think Judge Chutkan knows that, because she was waiting for the immunity decision to come back. And now that this filing has been released publicly, I think the schedule can continue completely unabated by election day.
Fair. I think that I just it's difficult because I think that judges are forced to take into account an extra bit of information, which is, how is what I'm about to say going to be taken by one side or the other? My statement should simply be truth, and it shouldn't be a springboard for either side to use to bolster their own position.
Well, the truth is always going to bolster one position or the other, because
I know
both sides are saying the other person is
but
lying.
it should do it simply because it is the truth, not because it's being used as a talking point. That I think is my problem. I don't want the truth to be used as a talking point. I just want the truth to be the truth, and for people to make their decisions based off of that truth, rather than and you know what, maybe my part, okay, I guess this is really what it is. My issue is not with the judicial system. It is with the parties that use the judicial system as a talking point to further their own positions. And I think that by them doing that, they undercut the judicial system's objectivity, I guess you might call it, in this situation. It will be used to overcompensate in one direction or the other. Yes, the judicial system should tell the truth. The political parties in this country should not be using the judicial system as springboards to further their own points.
Well, every week brings more and more news, so next week we'll be having a fresh batch of news and topics to talk about. Eventually, we're going to be talking about things like the Electoral College. We'll be talking about things like Project 2025. To check out the rest of our episodes, if you're watching this on YouTube, go to Spotify, go to Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Look up In Defense of the Fence podcast. If you're on Spotify or YouTube, check the video version out on YouTube at Writer Reacts.
Stay safe, stay informed, keep thinking critically.